What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carry inside. Mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm really pleased to have with me my very special guest, who is David Swanson. And I've known David for a long time. How are you doing tonight, David?
Good. Great to be here.
So David Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is executive director of worldbeyondwar.org and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. Swanson's books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. He blogs at davidswanson.org and warisacrime.org. He hosts Talk Nation Radio. He is a 2,215, 16, 17, 18, and 19 Nobel Peace Prize nominee. And he was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. I would like you to talk a little bit about your background as an anti-war activist. What made peace the most important issue for you to organize around? And what are some of the accomplishments that you've achieved in your lifetime of work that you are most proud of?
I was never pro-war. I was never indifferent to war. I don't have the sort of conversion on the road to Damascus story that many of my friends in Veterans for Peace have, turning against war. I was raised like most human beings on the planet, being told you should not use violence, you should not hit your friends. And I was raised in the United States and in the Washington, D.C. area, where you see the organization, the institution of mass murder as one of the biggest enterprises that your society is engaged in. And I didn't like contradictions. I told people they were hypocrites if they fed me contradictions. I didn't put up with anything when I was a kid. And so either mass murder is okay or it isn't. And if it isn't, well, then it's obviously the worst thing we do. And when you start to learn a little bit about it and find out it's the most expensive thing we do, and 3% of it could end starvation on the globe, well, it better damn well be really worth all the destruction and death and suffering caused by not investing in something else. And when you start to look at it and see it as one of the most environmentally destructive things and the worst corroder of our culture and promoter of racism and bigotry and hatred, well, this is something that really needs a major justification, or it is the single worst thing we're engaged in. And it took me till I was maybe 30 to be working on peace. There's no billion-dollar marketing campaign for peace the way there is for war. The inevitable natural war, it'll always be with us, but it needs a billion-dollar marketing campaign to keep it going. There are no ads for jobs in the peace movement anywhere. But eventually I found my way into it for lack of being able to hold a job where I wasn't, trying to make the world a better place and trying to make the world a better place in a major way that wasn't, one step up and two steps back. So I now managed to scrape by making a living working on peace. And major accomplishments, when you work in the peace movement, you are a small part of some major accomplishments that are always underplayed in the media and the culture. I mean, every time we prevent an urgent attack on Iran, if we don't attack Iran immediately, we're all going to die. In 2007 and 2015, every several years, that's an accomplishment. It doesn't go in the books. There's no, this is the day we didn't attack Iran holiday. But it does make it a little more laughable each time they bring it up again. Now, once again, we urgently need to attack Iran or we're all going to die, except for the last time and the time before that and the time before that. Not attacking Syria in 2013 was a major accomplishment. But I think the biggest accomplishment really is something that most people see as a failure. And that is related to the war on Iraq. That is organizing globally, including the biggest day of human mobilization in human history on February 15th, 2003, and moving nations and moving regions and making the UN say no to that war and making it illegal and making it scandalous, and then exposing the lies and the atrocities throughout that war to the point where it really, politicians were fleeing from it. Joe Biden to this day, Donald Trump to this day are pretending they weren't for it, and that, that's an accomplishment. The New York Times this week had a news article. I mean, they called it news analysis, whatever that is, but it was on the front page, not the opinion section, that said, watch whatever Mike Pompeo says. He's probably lying. When it comes to wars, these people are usually lying. My God, I mean, that's an environmental statement because you're going to cut out half the New York Times from now on, right? Yeah. You're going to shrink the paper. I mean, that, and it's not perfect and we have miles to go, but there has been an influence on our culture by the anti-war movement, including making people skeptical of lies, that I think is what I'm happiest to have been a part of.
Well, let me ask you this. So during the 60s, when there was a very robust anti-war movement, fighting the Vietnam War, I've always had a theory about that. That's because a lot of middle-class people were being drafted. And, there wasn't an economic situation that we have now where people need to, they can't afford college. There's no jobs in the heartland of the country for people without a college education. They go to war, they join the armed services basically to make a living or to get their college paid for, or to get health care or whatever. But back in the day, of course, I was just a child and you were too, there was this draft. And I have always agreed with Charlie Rangel, who every year keeps proposing that we bring back the draft, because I think it would be a major impetus to get rid of war. The other thing that I think about back then, and I want you to comment about both of these things, was television had gotten really big, at the time of the Vietnam War, and they were actually showing these campaigns and these bodies coming home in body bags. Now they're a lot more sophisticated. They figured out with the Iraq War how to embed the media into the soldiers, so they take a much more favorable view. And of course, we know that instead of having the view that it had back when Daniel Ellsberg was able to get the New York Times to publish the Pentagon Papers, which was also crucial to ending that war, New York Times was the biggest cheerleader in the form of Judith Miller and perpetuating all the BS that came from the military-industrial complex.
Well, these are huge topics that I've written about at enormous length and can talk about at hours. So I'll start talking a bit and you can tell me when to shut up. But, I recommend reading my books. This is the other thing I would say in terms of accomplishments is when people come up to you and say, your book changed my whole perspective. And events too. When you do events, if you speak to young people, you change their whole worldview in 45 minutes, but these are complex issues, but I disagree for the most part on the draft argument and agree for the most part on the media criticism. When it comes to the draft, I think we have to recognize that it didn't have the impact you're looking for in the Civil War on either side, in World War I, in World War II, in the war on Korea, or for several years in the war on Vietnam. And that when the war on Vietnam was finally ended, in large part because of the peace movement, you had 6 million dead bodies lying on the ground. And we haven't approached anything close to that in recent years in U.S. wars. There have been wars in Africa in recent decades that have approached that. And I think it's important to understand that the military very badly wants the draft, and they want to sneak it in through something called national service. And they want to be good feminists about it and impose it on young women too. And were it not for Republican Bible thumping barbarian lunatics who think women are subhuman, there would be now a draft imposed on women as a good feminist favor to them by the Democrats in Congress. They should be compelled to go to war against their will because that's their right. This is, I respectfully disagree. I think it should be ended for men, not imposed on women. And I think if you want to get rid of war, you stop facilitating it. But when it comes to what you mentioned about the poverty draft, this is exactly right. There is no bigger enemy of free college or any sort of decent society than the military. I mean, they're not going to have recruits if you have the choice of college. The vast majority joined for a great number of reasons, but among them, and high up on the list, is didn't have any better option. And I certainly agree with you on the media. I mean, there are ways in which it's always been as bad as it is, but fundamentally it has gotten dramatically worse, including on the topic of war. And you look at the Pentagon Papers and the New York Times in their conversations about whether to take the risk of publishing those stories or not, said we would be ashamed, we would be horrified if someone found out that we had this and didn't publish it. Right. But when they have that sort of story today, it's exactly the opposite conversation. And we have it documented and understood. They wouldn't, print anything that might have cost George W. Bush the election. Remember, they wouldn't print the NSA spying story because it might have impacted an election. God forbid people should vote based on what their government is doing. So the New York Times has really reversed that attitude.
Now let's talk about the Democratic Party, because I was, again, very young when they were protesting, outside of Chicago at the convention, and they were trying to decide who was more, anti-war, George McGovern, Hubert Humphrey, Eugene McCarthy. I read that stuff as history, and I find it very fascinating. I was a delegate for Bernie, and I was at the 2016 convention. What happened was, you probably know that the California delegation started a lot of chants, and one of those chants was no more war. And there was a Hillary delegate who got a hold of our chants and sent it to whoever was coordinating the Hillary delegation, and they were instructed to chant over us. Now, when we chanted Black Lives Matter, they said, no, chant with them. But when they chant no more war, chant USA. And it was just astonishing to me because, that is the chant they chant at Trump rallies. And of course, Hillary had up all those generals, touting her candidacy. The New York Times Magazine section did write an article, but it was after the New York primary, basically saying that she was the most hawkish of all the candidates, even including the Republicans. They waited to publish that after the primary. I had to ask, when did the Democratic Party become the party of war? Can you trace that back to any period in history and why you think that is? Is it just campaign contributions? Is it the fact that military, they put factories and bases in every state? I mean, I remember even Barbara Boxer, who was supposed to be so progressive, was defending a lot of these things. Bernie Sanders, as we know, has defended the F-35 fighter pilot because it produces a lot of jobs for his state.
Well, it doesn't, and that makes it even more tragic. And of course, Senator Leahy has been the big cheerleader for that in Vermont, and they're just this week bringing those first F-35s in, and people are going out and taking risks to protest them. To try to answer your question, I don't know if it helps much, but I think that since World War I, the Democratic Party has been a party of war, and I think since World War II, both the Democratic and Republican parties have been parties of war. And I think, anyone who had any doubts about Hillary Clinton's military madness had never paid any attention to Hillary Clinton. And I, my take on the candidates last time around was that none of them were good enough for me to support them. And the one that I wished would get to be good enough was Bernie Sanders. And I wrote an open letter and got lots of prominent people to sign it and organizations to support it. And you can go read it at worldbeyondwar.org/Bernie. And we got it in the media. We met with Bernie's staffers and they had read it and thought about it. And we asked Bernie to get better on foreign policy, get better on war and peace. You're going to talk about the budget. You're going to talk about finances. Notice the military budget, admit that it exists, admit that 60% of the money that Congress is deciding what to do with every year is going to war and war preparations, and have an opinion on it and talk about moving some of it to human needs and environmental needs. And he is. And it's miles left to go. And he's denouncing, the president of Venezuela and so forth. But he is miles ahead of the other candidates, and he is where I wanted him to be 4 years ago when I said, if you could just be this good, I'd get out there and work for you. So now I'm out there working for him.
Yeah, that's great. I noticed the same thing, too, about his foreign policy last year. And I think he's gotten a lot more sophisticated in other issue areas as well. I mean, one thing I like about Bernie, I feel like people get very set in their ways when they reach adulthood. And they're not very much open to changing their opinion. And one thing that I have always admired about myself, patting myself on the back here, is that when I'm presented with evidence that counters my opinion, I am not ashamed to, say, oh, I was wrong and change my opinion. And I noticed that quality in Bernie Sanders a lot, too. I felt it especially with regard to institutional and structural racism. He was a great believer in he always quoted Martin Luther King, who said, what's the use of being able to eat at a lunch counter if I can't afford the lunch? And so he was always very concerned with economic equality. But what he didn't realize, and I always use the example of Eric Holder, who is a wealthy corporate lawyer who became the attorney general, head lawyer of the land, still got pulled over for driving while black. So I think Bernie really came to learn a lot about this, and as a result now has probably one of the best racial justice and criminal justice platforms of all the candidates. And I think the same is true of war. But I want to talk to you about, because you mentioned Venezuela. I was very concerned when he did that 3-part tweet. And the first 2 parts were bad, but he ended up good. Basically he said he was a dictator. He said he was perpetrating violence on the protesters. He wasn't elected in a free election, but we should stay out of regime change wars. So I think that in some areas, I think maybe even in the area of Syria and maybe the area of North Korea, he could learn a lot more about really what's going on there. Even Russia, sometimes he buys into, I think, the propaganda of the military-industrial complex. In the 80s, he was such a fan of the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega. And I think he really understood what U.S. imperialism could do. And I just wonder if sometimes he just doesn't say what he knows because he doesn't want to seem so out there, confirming they already think he's a socialist. What do you think about some of these contradictions with him on some of these nationalist leaders, some of these socialist leaders, that he buys into the mainstream framing?
Yeah, I think he is open to changing his mind and learning and evolving and developing and being an actual small d Democrat and looking for shared wisdom and popular support. And those are all wonderful things. I think on war and peace, in large part, it's a question of getting him back to views he had 50 years ago. So it's not actually teaching him something new. It's reminding him of something old with a new twist. And so it's a question in large part of telling him that the public wants this and pushing him to be for peace. And so, he's been in Washington for so many years now, and he's absolutely surrounded by absolutely disgraceful sociopathic views. I mean, 4 years ago, he was talking about the best platform you could imagine on wages and labor and healthcare and college and environment. And then he was out there saying, now we need more wars and we need Saudi Arabia to pay its fair share and step up and get its hands dirty and pay for more wars, as if wars were a public service like buses and healthcare. And we just needed to force Saudi Arabia to pay for more of them instead of the United States. He's backed way away from that. You don't hear him this time around pushing for, we should get others to pay for more of the wars. He in fact is saying, let's not have any more wars. Let's end the current wars, which is perfect. Where he still has a step yet to take is he's still pushing the propaganda about the targeted, demonized leaders of foreign countries, so I'll push all the propaganda about the president of Venezuela. I'll pretend they have less credible elections than the United States does, even though it isn't true. And I'll, say everything the war propagandists want, but then at the end, I'll say, I don't actually want a war. Well, that's, that's miles better than most people in Washington. There are other candidates, including, I know you wanted to talk about her too, Tulsi Gabbard, who will say, actually, don't demonize Venezuela, don't start another war in Venezuela. And I think that's very helpful, but I think you look at them as a whole and they're not as good a candidate, even on this issue, as Bernie.
Right. Well, the thing with her is she's very clear to say that she is against regime change wars. And yet, when you go to Peace Action West, which is a peace organization that I respect, I don't know about you, but they have done a lifetime score of all the people that are currently holding office. And she only has a 51% lifetime score. And this is based on all of her votes, whether it's for war budgets, war authority, sanctions, letting in refugees, whatever it is. You can talk more specifically. But she has a 51% vote. And Bernie and Warren and Beto and Gillibrand, who dropped out, I just happened to see their scores, all have in the 80s. So I know that she has said she's, anti-regime change war, but she's a hawk on terrorism. And that put me very much in mind with George Bush, who used to say, we're going to have a war on terror. And we all used to mock him, saying, you can't have a war on terror. Terror is a tactic. What do you think of that, Tulsi's record? I mean, do you think she's as anti-war as most of her supporters think she is? I mean, after all, she's a soldier. That's what she chose to do. It's like we say Kamala is a cop, and we don't, we say that her career choice has something to do. She chose to be a prosecutor, not a defender. Well, Tulsi chose to go to war.
You'll recall that there was a years-long campaign for the 2003 assault on Iraq, and there were those of us denouncing the obvious lies and those out there pushing them. And to this day, people who pay attention are pushing back against Joe Biden's pretense that he wasn't the leading U.S. senator pushing the lies and pushing them for years afterwards and voting to fund the war for years afterwards. And you'll remember that by 2004 and getting on towards the end of 2004, I mean, even the New York Times publicly apologized for pushing the lies. Everybody was either pretending they hadn't believed it, pretending they hadn't been for it, pretending that they had fallen for these lies and they couldn't help it, and now they saw the light. Well, months later, Tulsi Gabbard volunteered to go join in the war on Iraq. Months after the whole damn society had pretended they had fallen for the lies or hadn't fallen for the lies, and the whole thing was in the past and we were mocking the stupid lies, Tulsi Gabbard went and signed up and joined in, helped destroy Iraq. And to this day, she hasn't even gone as far as Joe Biden in terms of pretending to be sorry about it. In fact, she brags about it. And she hardly opens her mouth to talk about peace. And I love what she says about peace. I love when she says, don't start this war, don't start that war. She can't help herself. Almost every time in the same breath, she brags about having helped destroy Iraq. She is to this day in the U.S. military. She just went on a U.S. military mission to Indonesia because she thought that maintaining U.S. empire in Indonesia was more important than running for president. This is who she is. So there is that problem that she glorifies the military. She promotes the military in every statement. where she opposes the bad wars. Like Obama, she's against the dumb wars, but not the smart wars, the bad wars, but not the good wars. And she doesn't define very clearly which they are, other than she's against, certain specific current wars that she would end, as would most of these candidates supposedly, as would Trump supposedly before he got in. The other big problem with Tulsi is that, to my mind, what you really have to look at is the money. And this is what I've said every damn election. This is what I said about Trump. Look, he says he's against regime change wars. He also says he wants to kill more of their families and steal their oil. What are we supposed to believe? Look at the money. He says, just like Obama said, bigger military budget. Well, look at Tulsi Gabbard. She's voted for the biggest military budgets in the history of the United States. She's voted for military budgets over and over again. She's voted against cutting the military budget by 1%. She's voted repeatedly against undoing the AUMF, the legalistic excuse for many of these wars. She's voted for new nuclear weapons to upgrade the nuclear arsenal. She's in favor of weaponization and militarization. She's just against particular wars. This is not good enough, and it's not the best that we have out there. And since she's not very good on many other issues, and she's not a very viable candidate, look, if you have to choose among this crop of candidates, go with the guy who's talking about moving hundreds of billions of dollars out of the military into human and environmental needs. I mean, you now have Elizabeth Warren saying she wants to cut the military, but she has, to my knowledge, yet to hint whether that's by 3 cents or 500 billion. She won't put enough. This is like Mrs. Finances, Mrs. Banker, Mrs. Economy, the expert with dollars and figures, and she won't give us an estimate within 100 billion of what she means by cut the military.
I know, and Bernie has clearly said he wants to cut it in half, so he's on the record with that one.
Yeah, which is wonderful, and he knows how much it is too. He knows it's $1.25 trillion across numerous agencies and departments. It's not just the Department of so-called Defense, and he knows where he wants to move the money. So it's not this big government or small government nonsense. It's what kind of government? We're going to move the money out of mass murder and into protecting the earth and the people who live on it. That's what we need.
The other thing is, too, let's talk a little bit about soft power, which is sanctions, which is funding these regime change NGOs over there. I just did my show about Hong Kong, and I learned so much when I prepare for a show. I just was kind of getting suspicious about all this, publicity we're giving these democracy protests in Hong Kong. So I happen to read Kevin Zeese's newsletter, popularresistance.org, which I encourage all my viewers to subscribe to. It comes out once a week. And Kevin Zeese is a longtime peace activist who you know. And he did a whole thing on, on Hong Kong. And he quoted Sarah Flounders, who's been a longtime peace activist. So she was on my show last week. And she taught me about the NED. I forget what it stands for, National Education
Endowment for Democracy.
And it's this group that is funding all these regime change groups, like the protesters in Hong Kong. They were behind a lot of these color wars. So sanctions, as we know from Iran, and the Lancet reported that 500,000 children were killed by the sanctions. And when Madeleine Albright was asked by Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes if she thought that was worth it, and she answered yes, that's when we knew what a war criminal she was. Anyway, so they've done sanctions on Cuba. They have sanctions on Iran, on Iraq, on Venezuela. So when I covered Tulsi's, she did a town hall with the Malibu Democratic Club. I asked a question. I said, will you go? This was at the time when Kevin and Margaret and the people from Code Pink were occupying the embassy when Trump illegally expelled the ambassador, and they had taken it over, and they were holding all sorts of educational forums. Maybe you attended one. And I asked Tulsi if she would go and stand with the embassy protectors, and if she would introduce a bill to end the sanctions on Venezuela. And her answer to me was she equivocated. She basically said, I am in touch with the people in the embassy and I'm taking direction for them. I'm going to do what they suggest I do. Well, I found out from talking to both Code Pink and Popular Resistance, were the only two groups that were in that embassy at that point, that none of them ever heard from Tulsi. That kind of concerned me, and plus all of her other votes for sanctions that are in the Peace Action West record. And also Ro Khanna. I just tweeted him the other day. He was talking about, he and Bernie are so proud of their resolution to, get out of the war in Yemen or stop funding the Saudis or, however that resolution read. But, they could really go further. They could actually introduce bills to end these sanctions. What are your thoughts about that?
Of course they could. And this is why you look at something like a 51% rating on a peace action scale. I mean, this is a very generous, graded on a curve, partisan, pick out 8 bills and see how they did sort of score. I mean, none of these people deserve, above a 10% if you were really looking for peace leaders. And so it's a question of, who's doing better than others and which things can we promote and where can we encourage them all to do better, those who are doing the best and those who are doing the worst. We call soft power things that kill millions of people. And it's soft in the sense that there's no explosions, but there's starvation, there's disease epidemic, there's resulting violence facilitated by all of the suffering. And it was Iraq where at least 500,000 children had already died above the existing high death rate when Madeleine Albright was asked that question. And I asked her relatively recently about it. You can look at the video on my YouTube and to this day, and she told me she was sorry she had said that. She wasn't sorry she had thought it. She wasn't sorry she had done it. And I asked her immediately, what about Iran? How many children would whatever it is be worth killing in Iran? And she said, I'm for sanctions in Iran. That's totally different. Well, it's not totally different. And there are children dying in Iran right now because of sanctions. And Trump is increasing sanctions and everybody's cheering because that's better than starting World War III. It's not that much better. It's still hostile. It's still aggressive. It's a step toward greater war, and it's deadly. There are these accusations against Iran of engaging in violence that are, usually undocumented, often blatantly false. But this is the point. This is what they want from Iran. They want violence from Iran. They've been making false accusations. They've been assassinating and sanctioning and sabotaging and tearing up agreements with Iran for decades, trying to provoke violence. And when they get it, they're going to have a war.
I mean, it's so amazing to me because I read that, Trump doesn't want a war with Iran. Saudi Arabia doesn't want a war with Iran. Pompeo is the one seeming to push for this. And we all thought that he was the better one between him and Bolton. So This is clearly the military industrial complex, which I used to call the deep state, by the way, until it got associated with the alt-right. But I first heard the term on Bill Moyer's show. He did a show back in 2013, I think it was, called Anatomy of the Deep State with Mike Lofgren, who was a congressional staffer. And he talked about the military industrial intelligence complex backed by Wall Street, which really runs things. You might also call it the permanent government. I remember reading in Confidence Man, Ron Suskind's book about the first 2 years of Obama's presidency, where he had unparalleled access. Even in cabinet meetings, he said that when Obama ever tried to press for anything, relating to pulling back from these wars, he was thwarted by these advisors. Because I think the anti-war movement is pretty anemic in this country right now. I think all the energy is going to the climate movement. And you interviewed Russell Gray from Extinction Rebellion, and it was a great interview because you pressed him. You said, can you just add a couple more words to your platform about, peace? Well, why don't you say what you asked for and how he answered? Because really, it was the Green New Deal that was by Jill Stein, and even before that by Howie Hawkins, who is going to be running on the Green Party ticket this year. He's going to be on my show. He was the one to first talk about the Green New Deal, and the Green Party Green New Deal always included an anti-militarism plank. AOC's significantly does not. Sunrise Movement doesn't talk about this.
The first new recent big D Democratic Party Green New Deal proposal to acknowledge the existence of the military is Bernie's, which does so only marginally. I think, we've had these sort of big coalition marches, March for the Climate, March for Women, March for People, March for literally everything, was one of them. Where we've tried to force peace into the list of acceptable liberal progressive things. And often it has been a very uphill struggle. And sometimes it's clearly been because there were weapons making labor unions in the coalition, or there was war money in the coalition, or there were just truly cowardly or big D Democratic Party groups in the coalition. In this case, with Shutdown DC, all the individuals involved, these are not the big environmental groups. These are the groups willing to do nonviolent action. They are individually totally open to opposing war and have invited us to create affinity groups and be part of it. So on Monday, I'm going to be out there in the streets in DC, shutting down DC, risking arrest for climate with our totally acceptable, no more wars for oil and no more oil for wars. And these are one and the same issue, posters and signs and so forth. But, they didn't put it on their website. They said every affinity group can send us a statement and we'll put all those statements on our website by Friday. Well, we're getting close to Friday, so we'll see. But, we had a meeting the other night in DC with Naomi Klein and Reverend Yearwood and so forth. And it's not that they don't know war exists. It's not that they're not against war. Reverend Yearwood used to come to every peace rally before Obama got in. It just hasn't entered their minds deeply enough that they mention it. They mention all the different intersectionality and types of groups in the coalition and issues we need to be up, and war and peace just never come to mind and never get mentioned. It's not because of any sort of corruption. It's just the culture we live in. So it's an uphill struggle, and we got to keep working with these other groups to the extent we can and showing them how much peace activists want to save the environment and educating them what the connections are. Not that they haven't heard it, but let them hear it again until we reach the point where they start saying it.
Yeah. I'm kind of against those budget things, like saying half of our budget goes to war, because I'm kind of an adherent, although I don't totally understand it, of modern monetary theory, which basically says when you have fiat currency, you fund things not out of actual deposits in banks, but on computer entries.
Well, I would be delighted for them to simply invent money for good things. I would be delighted for them to tax corporations. I would be thrilled for them to tax billionaires. The reason that I say move the money out of the military and into good things is twofold. Number one, I want the money out of the military. And number two, I want the money in the good things. It also gets around the big government, small government nonsense that dominates U.S. political discourse, where I'm supposedly for big taxes and spending, and the other guy is who wants the $1 trillion military is supposedly for small government and cuts. And it matters how the candidates answer those "how you going to pay for it" questions, because 4 years ago, Bernie's typical answer was rather complicated and had something to do with raising taxes. And there was an explanation of how most of those taxes were not your taxes, they were rich people's taxes. But it was not as good an answer as I'm going to move 3% of the military budget, which, by the way, we've recently doubled and is making us less safe and destroying the earth and is going to kill us all if we leave it alone. I'm going to take 3% of that and move it over and cover this. That would have been a better answer. And we asked him to start making that answer, and he never would 4 years ago. And now he will this time around. And that's a huge improvement, in my opinion. no matter where you think the money comes from or how much of it you think there is, I think that's a better answer, in his campaign. What I've heard him say more often, which is pretty close to saying it, is that the world needs to stop spending money on weapons. That is, if the world weren't spending $2 trillion a year on weapons, it could be spending money on useful things like a Green New Deal and healthcare and so forth. He's said that many times. And one problem with that, of course, is that half of the world's military spending is the U.S. government, and another quarter is its NATO allies. So NATO is 3/4 of world military spending. Another problem with it is that most of the other military spenders are buying the weapons from the United States. The United States is arming 73% of the governments that the United States government says are dictatorships. Right. So, the questions I would love to ask candidates mostly have never been asked, any of them, and never will, Right. So which dictatorships would you stop arming and training? Which bases would you close? Which treaties would you join? We're never going to get to any of this, but, we get a little bit here and there, and Bernie has definitely improved.
Chris Hedges has a book, Death of the Liberal Class, where he talks about how all the institutions that were supposed to represent us have failed us, whether it's the media, the university, the Democratic Party, trade unions. Everybody's been co-opted, which is why for a very long time, he's been saying the only answer is mass nonviolent civil disobedience, which is exactly what Extinction Rebellion is saying. And, when I heard you interview that Russell Gray, he was talking about how everybody was going to get on the streets, how we were going to start these citizen assemblies. And I was thinking to myself, I looked at his bio, he graduated in 2017. So during Occupy, he was still a kid. He was like in middle school or something? We did that already. We tried that. We actually had 350 occupations worldwide. We were doing general assemblies. Everybody's got these great ideas about how we're going to turn things around when we have less than 12 years to stop catastrophic climate change. And I think that the two biggest existential threats are catastrophic climate change and nuclear annihilation. But I want to pivot a little bit to Trump, because I want to talk about why you're against this impeachment, because you've been in favor. I just found out earlier from talking to you, you've been in favor of impeaching every president since Reagan. So I think that Trump, I don't know how sincere he was about opposing the Iraq war, but quite frankly, I don't think Trump has a political ideology. I think Trump only cares about himself, and he sees the world in relation to how it makes him look and whether it makes his businesses money. And that's it. I remember a couple years ago, 2017, Trump was tweeting about how we were going to get out of Syria. And then all of a sudden, there was one of those false flags, that phony chemical attack that turned out to be not true. And Cy Hirsch proved that it was not true. And also the one in 2014, which is what got us into the Civil War in the first time, because remember, Obama said you can't cross that red line, and now he's gassing his own people. That's always what they say when they try to get us into Saddam is gassing his own people. Assad is gassing his own people. Everybody's gassing their own people. Libya, so we've got to go in there. Trump, no sooner than he tweeted that, then there was that gas attack, and now he's calling him he's calling Assad tweeting gas killing animal or something to that effect. Same thing with North Korea. He tries to make peace with North Korea, and everybody comes out with the propaganda. And then the same thing about Maduro, all this propaganda that they're attacking their own people, they're attacking protesters, what have you. Getting back to this permanent state, how do you see us ever overcoming that before, climate change kills us?
I don't see that because I can't see the future. I don't predict success or failure. I don't have any crystal ball or magical insights. I think we have a moral responsibility. And on top of that, it's much more enjoyable to do our damnedest to most strategically and effectively work for survival. And we may survive and we may not. I think when you say you're pivoting from climate and nuclear apocalypse to Trump, I don't think it's much of a pivot. I think the main reason, the first and foremost reason I want him out of the White House immediately is because he is a significant threat of nuclear apocalypse and of exacerbating climate collapse as rapidly as he possibly can. And I've been accused of being obsessed with impeachment, but since the topic for tonight was going to be impeachment, just to mention why I'm now against impeaching a president for the first time. It's not because I don't want Trump impeached and convicted and removed. This is someone who is blatantly corrupt now. Not just violating the two emoluments clauses with financial corruption, as we accused him of on Inauguration Day, but blatantly advertising it, promoting it, glorying in his immunity from impeachment. This is someone who's threatened nuclear war, who's engaged in illegal wars, who's incited domestic violence and racist domestic violence, who's declared emergencies to violate the will of Congress, who's abused the pardon power, who's tried to ban Muslims, who's put kids in cages separated from their parents, this is absolute lawlessness. But what the Democrats are committed to doing will only make it worse. They are not willing to impeach him for any of these things, many of which are public acts that are indisputable, no investigation required or even conceivable. Instead, they want to go on endlessly investigating Russiagate, making themselves look like idiots, making Trump look good, guaranteeing a failure, at least in the Senate, if not the House, and dooming the impeachment process so that in Trump's second term or whoever comes next, there will be an understanding that nobody must ever be impeached for anything because impeachment is a bad process. They'll blame the impeachment process for their bad impeachment, the way they blame, the election process or Russia or Vladimir Putin for their bad candidates and their bad campaigns. So I think it's going to hurt impeachment. It's going to hurt the country. It's going to benefit Trump, and it's going to increase the Cold War, risking nuclear apocalypse further than Trump is doing on his own, because you're going to have the Democrats and the Republicans competing with each other to say, well, I'm against this abuse by Trump, but I'm also against Russia, the evil Russia, or I defend Trump against these phony accusations, but I'm as mad at Russia as the next guy. It's going to do great damage to the relationship between the two nuclear armed countries. And I spent years pushing and prodding and hoping and demanding and lobbying to get them off the Russiagate nonsense onto any of the proven impeachable offenses. And it's very clear from Gerald Nadler's statements and resolutions and behavior that it will not happen. Impeachment just means Russiagate to these people.
Well, did you read that there was a case on the emoluments clause that just went into appeal?
Yes.
One of the three cases. Do you think that has any chance of success? Probably not during his term of office, though, right?
Well, I don't know how long it will take. I think it's absolutely disgraceful for Congress to turn to the courts and for Congress to rely on state governments and private businesses to turn to the courts to try to hold a U.S. president accountable for a quintessentially impeachable offense of blatantly violating the Constitution in an unprecedented manner. One of the problems with impeachment, of course, is that the last guy did half the stuff too, and the guy before him and the guy before him. So both parties and they themselves, commit a lot of these abuses. But a lot of, when I go through the list, and rootsaction.org has articles of impeachment against Trump, dozens of them drafted, ready to go. When you read through them, a lot of them are unprecedented, things that no previous president did. And that's the sort of financial corruption that Trump is engaged in. It's absolutely, even on the Russiagate investigation, which is the thing they want to investigate, and now the Ukraine investigation and so forth. The White House and subordinates of Donald Trump are blatantly refusing to comply with Congress and to comply with subpoenas. You have a secret agency refusing to turn any information over to Congress, and Congress rolling over and taking it. Imagine where that leads. I'm all for holding Trump accountable for abusing power and refusing to comply with Congress, but why tie it to Russiagate when it's going to blow up in your face and maybe in all of our faces? Why not make it around a legitimate impeachable offense?
Well, let me ask you about that, because in your article, you said when you were listing these are not the reasons I'm not opposed. I mean, I'm opposing this impeachment. One of the reasons you said was not the reason was that it would not succeed in the Senate. That seems to be Nancy Pelosi's reason. She thinks that why are we going to start this process if it has no chance of success because of the Senate? And, it's only going to rev up Trump's base. I personally disagree with that because like you and Norman, I think you cannot allow impeachable offenses to go unaccounted for. I remember when, during the entire Bush administration, I had this shirt that said impeach Bush and Cheney, and then another one that had the war criminals of Bush, Cheney, Colin Powell, and Condoleezza Rice on it. And I even went at a Crosby, Stills and Nash concert at the Hollywood Bowl. Neil Young was there with them, and he had just written a song called Let's Impeach the President. And I tried to get a hold of them to say, will you announce, because Paul Koretz, who is my city councilman now, but at the time he was in the state assembly, he introduced articles of impeachment from the California State Assembly. And you remember, I think it's, if all 3/5 of the states do it, it can happen. So he did it, and I wanted, Neil Young to announce before singing the song that, people should support this. And I could not get through to his people. But I remember just like being so adamant that you cannot allow these crimes, because if you do allow these crimes, you consolidate more power in the hands of the next president. So sure enough, when Obama said, we're not going to do, look at any of this stuff because we're going to look forward, he consolidated more power with himself.
I agree with you now. I agreed with you then. I said so then. I think if you look at the history of impeachments in this country and elsewhere, there have been many more impeachment efforts than anybody is told about, and many of them have effectively reversed the abuses of power short of getting to impeachment, much less conviction. So it's not just your responsibility, your duty, your sworn oath to do your job and try to impeach regardless of predicting what the Senate's going to do, but it's often been very effective to do that. And remember that Nancy Pelosi refused to impeach George W. Bush or Richard B. Cheney when the Democrats controlled the Senate. It wasn't because we don't control the Senate. It was because she is against impeaching anyone, and it was more important to elect Obama, or it was more, before Obama was quite on the horizon, it was more important to do something else. This is not, her thinking is we must roll over because Trump has a base, and if we ever do anything anybody actually supports, it will anger his base. But I'm a Democrat in the Democratic Party, which has no base, right? This is how they think. Now, there are millions of people who think of themselves as the Democratic Party's base, who would go absolutely nuts for impeachment and start flinging money at these people, but they don't believe it. They don't think of themselves as having a base. They only think of the other people as having a base. And they're always against doing anything dramatically good, because all they think is it would be bad. It would excite the Trump voters against us. Well, why wouldn't it incite the Bernie voters for you? They can't think that step of the way. And so they're always, against losing rather than for winning. And the Bill Clinton impeachment, of course, was held up all during the George W. Bush years, when we had national polls, corporate media polls, showing a majority of the country in favor of impeaching George W. Bush without any impeachment on the table, in Congress. And the argument you would get from Democrats was, well, actually, people didn't like the Clinton impeachment, so impeachments aren't popular. Right. Well, popular impeachments have been popular. unpopular impeachments have been unpopular, and impeachments that people didn't think would be popular, like Nixon's, which got going just before he stepped out of town, became very popular very quickly. And when you hold hearings on TV about actual documented, established outrages that people can understand, you influence the public and you influence the media and you influence the senators. So who knows what's possible if you try something? It would shock everybody to begin with if you tried something, and who knows how they would start thinking, after they'd been shocked.
Well, during the Nixon impeachment, which I remember very clearly, and I was at Cornell Summer School. It was one of those summer programs in high school where you get college credit. And I was sitting in my dorm room, and I had one of those teeny little TVs on top of the bureau. And I remember I have a visual memory of watching him, walk on the White House lawn with Pat and the dog and climb the stairs of Air Force One or the helicopter or whatever it was and wave. And I was just cheering. I mean, I was riveted to those hearings, but that was a different time. That was when the Republicans, like some of them were reasonable. You actually had moderate Republicans. I mean, remember Nixon himself would be considered a flaming liberal today based on some of the things that he did. I mean, I think really things got extremely partisan, and Congress really broke with Newt Gingrich and his, contract with America, which really should have been called a contract on America, because he was just like John Boehner and Mitch McConnell, where they basically said they weren't going to do anything that the Democrats wanted to do. So they don't really care if government functions. But see, they're very effective. If they want to impeach Clinton, they get it done. If they want to put in Gorsuch and hold off on Merrick Garland for a solid year, they get it done. I mean, the Democrats are complete wusses, which is one of the reasons, aside from them cheating Bernie, that I exited 2 years ago.
Well, I congratulate you on that, and I have the privilege of living in Virginia, where you don't have to join any party, and you just show up and tell them which primary you want to vote in, and you don't have to swear your life away to one of these criminal institutions in order to vote in their primaries. So it's not a big issue. So I think the only thing the state of Virginia does better in politics than other states. But I do think that there was, there's been a gradual collapse of U.S. politics over my lifetime. But I do think that when Newt Gingrich was in Congress and there was talk of a peace dividend, there was talk of this topic that we mentioned earlier of actually moving money either to tax cuts for ordinary people or to decent spending on useful stuff. And it was really Newt Gingrich, the congressman from Lockheed Martin, the congressman from Georgia, who put a stop to that, and including, through ginning up scandals against Democrats, including the House Speaker at the time, right? And we really haven't seen a serious push for a bill on conversion, the conversion from military industry to non-military industry since that year. There was a bill that was even closer to passing just before Kennedy was shot. On military conversion to peaceful industries. And we really haven't seen that gain traction in the U.S. Congress since Newt Gingrich.
I guess that's what we have to do. We have to, just like we have to retrain people and get them out of the fossil fuel industry, we have to retrain people, get them out of the weapon industry. I mean, the whole thing about the Green New Deal, and before them, climate mobilization, Margaret Salomon's group that wanted to start, they were using this language about the World War II style mobilization. We see how easy it is, how we were able to do it during World War II, is retrain people and retool these factories. And if we just did that for green energy, we could solve both of these problems at once. We could give people jobs, get them out of the weapons which kill people, and not only kill people in war, kill people here on the streets of our cities. But I just want to ask you one final question, because we've gone over the time, but I just want to know your opinion on this group, Refuse Fascism, because I'm having a representative from them on my show Sunday night. I've been very impressed with, they're trying to organize this coalition, this very broad-based coalition to end what they call the Trump Pence regime. And they have been dutifully out at every fundraiser that Trump has had. The only people who were there, even though I announced this all over Facebook, was the Refuse Fascism people, and people said to me, well, some people don't like to organize with them because they're RevCom, Bob Avakian's group. And I do think it's a little cultish the way they, tout him and his writings and his sayings and everything like that. But let's face it, they have been really the only ones sounding the alarm about this coming fascism. I want to know what you think of that. If you really do worry that, what some people are saying, that if Trump loses the election, he'll refuse to leave, he'll declare martial law, whatever he'll do. Do you really think that his regime is fascist? And also, what do you think of this group, Refuse Fascism, and the fact that people don't want to work with them? My feeling was like, so what? Who cares that they organize the protest? Anytime this president comes to town, we should be here protesting him. The Bernie people should be here. The environmental people should be here. The abolish ICE people should be here. They should all be there. And what does that say when in all of Los Angeles, you can only muster up 25 people to protest Trump, and they had the MAGA people, 25 people of them on the other side?
I can criticize what I disagree with among a group of people who do show up. My criticism, I think, has to be stronger for everybody who doesn't show up. Everybody who stays home and watches football, I think, deserves the most criticism. My advice in forming coalitions and working together on critical, urgent causes is be willing to be a little bit uncomfortable, be willing to work with people who you disagree with wildly on other issues, if you can work effectively together on this issue. My advice to movements as to how we could do things best would be to not promote an ideology of violence. And the people who are fans of Bob Avakian, they don't bring weapons and promote violence and chant hatred. They'll just tell you they're for the violent overthrow of the government if you really ask them and push them. And so, since nobody really asks them and pushes them, what does it matter?
Right.
Maybe it doesn't. I'm just telling you my ideal of how we're going to build the largest movement that succeeds because it brings in the most people is that we do what, for example, Shutdown DC is doing on Monday, and as be publicly and thoroughly and explicitly and graphically nonviolent. This is how we get more people to join in. This is how we take the moral high ground. This is how we present something against fascism that isn't in any way fascistic.
Thank you so much, David. Your work can be found at davidswanson.org and worldbeyondwar.org. Thanks for all your work all these years as being a peace activist. Lord knows we certainly need it. So thank you.
Same to you. Thank you.
Good night, everybody, and keep fighting.